23-year-old man comes home from work on an ordinary Friday morning and finds his own front door locked from the inside. He knocks. He tries the handle. Nothing. Standing behind him, watching him fail to get in, is his father, a man who has just walked out of that same house only minutes before. His father doesn't offer to help. He doesn't explain. He simply tells his son, without raising his voice, that he cannot go inside because he has just killed his mother. This is the story of Rachel McDaid and the husband who planned her death, carefully enough to arrange care for his dog before he ever picked up the bootlace he had already decided to use on her. Now, if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found this channel. Every day, I dive deep into real criminal cases, breaking them down piece by piece so we can actually understand what happened and why. If that sounds like something you'd be into, go ahead and hit subscribe. It's free, and it means a lot. Okay, now let's get back to the case. Rachel McDaid was 53 years old, living in Eastwood, a town on the edge of Nottinghamshire, raising 3 sons in the same house she had shared with her husband for years before their marriage broke down. Her family would later describe her, in the plainest terms possible, as the most beautiful, selfless, and strongest woman they knew. Motherhood sat at the center of everything friends and relatives said about her. She had, in her family's own words, put 100% into raising her 3 boys and adored them completely. Even as her marriage was ending, even as she navigated the practical difficulties of separating a household with 3 children still at home, those around her described a woman entirely defined by her devotion to her sons rather than by whatever conflict remained with the man she had once married. That marriage had, by 2024, effectively come apart. Michael had moved out 4 years earlier, choosing to live on a narrowboat rather than remain in the family home. But separation, in this case, didn't mean a clean break. He continued returning to the house regularly to see his sons and to collect tools for his work. Rachel, according to prosecutors, still held on to some hope that the relationship might eventually be repaired, even as Michael, in the words used at his sentencing, strung her along, quietly cancelling the insurance on her car and her home behind her back, in the months before she finally filed for divorce. It's a detail that reframes everything else about Rachel's final months. She wasn't simply a woman going through an ordinary separation. She was a woman being deceived, in small, practical, almost invisible ways, by someone she still hoped to reconcile with, right up until the day he arrived at her door with something else entirely in mind. That kind of quiet, sustained deception rarely shows up in the outward signs people usually look for when trying to gauge whether someone is safe. Rachel wasn't isolated from friends or family. She wasn't visibly frightened of her estranged husband, at least not in any way that alarmed the people around her. She was simply a woman managing the ordinary logistics of a long separation, insurance paperwork, shared custody arrangements around visits, the low hum of unresolved feelings that so many long marriages leave behind even after they formally end. Nothing about that picture reads, in hindsight, like the lead-up to a killing, and that is, in many ways, exactly the point. Michael McDaid was 60 years old, living alone on a narrow boat near the family home he had left 4 years earlier. To the people who crossed paths with him during that time, he would likely have registered as nothing more than an estranged husband, maintaining reasonable contact with his children, the kind of arrangement plenty of separated families settle into without anyone thinking twice about it. He and Rachel had spent, in the words used by their own son at his sentencing, more than half of Rachel's life together. That length of shared history is worth sitting with, because it means the man who eventually killed her wasn't a stranger, or a recent partner, or someone she had known only briefly. He was someone who had been present for decades of her adult life, who knew her routines, her schedule, and precisely when she would be alone in the house on any given morning. By the time their marriage formally ended, Michael's visits to the family home had settled into a familiar, low-key pattern, dropping by to see the boys, picking up tools he still needed for work. Nothing about that routine, on its surface, gave anyone reason for concern. It was ordinary enough that nobody around the family thought to question it, right up until the morning Michael used that same routine and the trust it had quietly built to make sure Rachel would be alone when he arrived. There is something particularly unsettling about how ordinary Michael's public presentation remained throughout those 4 years apart. He wasn't a man who had cut contact or vanished from his sons' lives or given anyone reason to describe him as volatile. He continued showing up, continued being, by every outward measure, a functioning, if separated, father. That consistency is precisely what allowed him to arrive on the morning of 19 April 2024 without raising a single flag, because by then, his presence at that house had become so routine that nobody thought to ask why he was there or to wonder what he might be carrying with him. What separates this case from many others is how little emotional escalation there appears to have been in the days immediately before the killing. There was no reported argument that spiraled out of control, no single triggering event described at trial. Instead, what emerges from the evidence is something colder and more deliberate, a plan, formed in advance, executed with almost administrative precision. In the lead-up to the morning of 19 April 2024, Michael made a series of small, practical arrangements that only make sense in hindsight. He asked a friend to look after his dog, explaining that this might be necessary if something happened to him, effectively planning for his own imprisonment before he had committed the act that would lead to it. He packed items for the dog into a carrier bag, ready to hand over. And at some point before setting out that morning, he took a bootlace, roughly 2 meters long, and fashioned it into a garrotte, tying loops at each end. None of this activity was visible to Rachel. As far as she knew, this was simply another one of Michael's routine visits, the kind that had become unremarkable over 4 years of separation. She had no reason to treat that Friday morning differently from any other. Michael, meanwhile, had already worked out exactly how the day would end, down to what would happen to his dog once he was behind bars. He drove towards the house that morning, but didn't go straight in. He parked around the corner instead and waited, watching for the moment he could be certain Rachel was alone inside. There's a particular kind of patience embedded in that single decision to park around the corner rather than pull up outside as usual. It suggests a man who had already rehearsed the morning in his head, who understood that success depended not on speed but on timing, on making sure no witness, no third party, no unexpected variable would interrupt what he had already decided to do. That level of self-control, maintained right up until the moment he stepped through the door, stands in stark contrast to the version of events his defense would later try to present in court. At around 9:30 on the morning of 19 April 2024, once he was confident Rachel was alone in the house, Michael McDaid entered the property on Nottingham Road, Eastwood. Using the garrotte he had prepared in advance, he strangled her to death. Prosecutors would later tell the court that Rachel had no injuries suggesting any real opportunity to fight back, and that Michael himself was found with no marks on his body either. Before leaving the house, he moved through it methodically, locking every door from the inside, and did so, according to the evidence presented at trial, only once he was certain she was dead. He then left the property. Just a few minutes later, he returned and found one of his 3 sons, 23-year-old Owen, standing outside, home from work, unable to get through the locked door. Michael watched his son try the handle, watched him fail to get inside. Then, showing no visible emotion, he told him plainly that he could not go into the house because he had just killed his mother. Michael got into his van and drove away. Owen went on to discover his mother's body inside the house shortly afterwards. Within minutes, Michael called the police himself and told them what he had done. He then drove back towards Nottingham Road, where he was arrested within meters of the family home. When officers later searched the narrowboat where Michael had been living, they found a boot with its lace missing, matching the garrotte used to kill Rachel. He was charged with murder, along with a separate charge of possessing a small quantity of cannabis found during the search. The speed of his confession is itself worth noting. Within minutes of leaving the house, having already told his own son what he had done, Michael picked up the phone and told police the same thing, unprompted, without any attempt to construct an alternative account or buy himself time. There was no chase, no standoff, no denial once officers arrived. He was arrested calmly, a matter of meters from the house where his wife lay dead, on the same street he had spent years walking as a father, coming to visit his children. This case is unusual among cases of domestic homicide because so much of it rests not on forensic reconstruction, but on a full and immediate confession offered by Michael himself within minutes of the killing. There was no missing persons appeal, no lengthy manhunt, no competing theory of events to disprove. What investigators had to do instead was establish the degree of planning behind what he had already admitted to doing, because that single question, whether this was premeditated or a sudden loss of control, would define how the case was ultimately sentenced. The physical evidence supported a picture of calculated preparation rather than impulsive violence. The bootlace itself, deliberately shaped into a garrotte with loops tied at either end, was not something improvised in the heat of an argument. It had been prepared before Michael ever left his narrowboat that morning. The missing lace from the boot recovered during the search of his home directly connected him to that object, closing off any possibility that the ligature had simply been something found at the scene. The timeline of his movements told a similar story. Rather than arriving at the house and encountering Rachel unexpectedly, Michael parked some distance away and waited, a detail prosecutors highlighted specifically to demonstrate intent, someone confirming his victim's isolation before acting rather than reacting to circumstances as he found them. The act of locking every door from the inside afterwards, only once he was sure Rachel was dead, pointed to a level of composure and control inconsistent with panic. Perhaps the most telling piece of evidence, though, wasn't physical at all. It was the arrangement made in advance for someone to care for his dog should anything happen to him. That single, almost mundane detail did more to establish premeditation in the eyes of the court than almost anything else presented, because it demonstrated that Michael had already accepted, before he ever entered the house, that he would very likely be going to prison that day. A man planning to defend himself later as having acted in a moment of uncontrollable rage does not, as a rule, first organize long-term care for his pet. Taken together, the evidence in this case didn't need to answer the question of what happened. Michael had already answered that himself within minutes. Its real purpose was to establish, beyond any doubt, exactly how long he had been planning it, because that single distinction between a sudden loss of control and a calculated act prepared well in advance was what ultimately shaped the length of the sentence handed down to him. Nothing in this section is a clinical diagnosis of Michael McDaid. It is an attempt to understand the pattern of his behavior based only on what was presented in court and by his own son afterwards. What stands out most in this case is the gap between the calculated planning beforehand and the complete absence of visible emotion during and after the act itself. Michael did not appear to be a man overwhelmed by rage in the moment. He was a man who had already made peace, days or weeks in advance, with the idea that he was about to end his wife's life and lose his own freedom as a result. That kind of advance acceptance, arranging care for a pet, preparing a weapon, waiting patiently outside for the right moment, suggests someone who had already resolved the moral question for himself long before he ever walked through Rachel's front door. Just as telling is what happened in the courtroom afterwards. Rather than expressing remorse, consistent with the planning already established against him, Michael's defense instead attempted to reframe Rachel, describing her as having a narcissistic personality, an attempt, as the prosecution characterized it, to present himself as the victim of the relationship rather than the man who had ended his wife's life. It is a pattern seen in other cases of intimate partner homicide, a defendant reaching, after the fact, for any narrative that might shift the emotional weight of the crime away from himself and onto the person no longer able to respond. The moment with his son outside the locked door deserves separate attention, because it reveals something about Michael distinct from the planning itself. He did not attempt to stop Owen from finding out. He did not delay, soften, or avoid the truth. He stated it plainly, without elaboration, to a young man who had simply come home from work expecting an ordinary day. Whether that reflects a kind of numbness following the act, or something closer to indifference toward the impact of his own words, it stands as one of the coldest details in the entire case. A father choosing total honesty at the exact moment total honesty would cause the most damage. It is worth contrasting that composure with how quickly Michael also confessed to police. Some might read the speed of that confession as a form of accountability, a man immediately admitting what he had done rather than forcing a prolonged investigation. But placed alongside everything else, the prepared garrotte, the arrangements for his dog, the wait around the corner, the confession reads less like remorse and more like the final, logical step in a plan he had already fully accepted the consequences of. He wasn't confessing because guilt had suddenly overwhelmed him. He was confessing because the outcome, his own arrest and imprisonment, had been part of the plan from the very beginning. The detail in this case that tends to affect people most isn't the strangulation itself, or even the advanced planning around the family dog. It's the fact that Michael McDaid had spent 4 years as a normal, if separated, presence in his children's lives, visiting regularly, collecting tools, seeing his sons, all while quietly building toward a day none of them could have anticipated. That raises a genuinely difficult question about how much warning cases like this one actually give, if any at all. There was no documented pattern of threats, no history of reported violence between Michael and Rachel that surfaced during the trial, nothing that would have flagged him, in the eyes of anyone around the family, as a serious risk. He was simply an estranged husband, one of thousands across the country in similar arrangements, quietly managing the practical details of separation until the morning he wasn't. There's also something worth sitting with in the specific cruelty of what he told Owen at the door. Many perpetrators of domestic homicide attempt to delay discovery, to create distance between themselves and what has happened, sometimes even staging a scene to suggest another explanation entirely. Michael did the opposite. He offered his son the plain, immediate truth, unsoftened and unexplained, in the same tone he might have used to say the house was locked because he'd forgotten his keys. It's worth asking what that choice says about the line between confession and cruelty, whether total honesty, delivered without warning or care for its impact, can itself become another form of harm inflicted on the people left behind. Finally, there's the matter of Rachel's own hope for reconciliation, quietly undermined by the very insurance policies Michael had been cancelling behind her back. It's a detail that complicates the neat separation between emotional and practical abuse. Rachel wasn't simply waiting and hoping in the dark. She was, in small, invisible ways, actively being deceived by someone she trusted enough to still imagine a future with, right up until the moment that trust cost her everything. It's a pattern worth naming clearly, because it doesn't fit the more familiar image of coercive control that tends to dominate public understanding of domestic abuse: the raised voice, the visible restriction, the obvious fear. What happened to Rachel in her final months looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. Cancelled paperwork, routine visits, a husband who still came round to see his sons. It's precisely that ordinariness that makes the case so difficult to sit with, and precisely why cases like this one rarely come with the kind of warning signs the public instinctively looks for. At sentencing, it was Owen, 23 years old, who stood in court and spoke directly to his father. He called him a coward. He said he was truly ashamed to have ever called him Dad, that Michael had ruined every single childhood memory he had, and that he was no father of his, only, in Owen's own words, a monster. It is a rare thing in any courtroom to hear a son dismantle a parent so completely, and rarer still to understand, listening to it, exactly how deserved every word of it was. Rachel's family, in their own statement, chose to remember her differently, not through the details of how she died, but through who she had been while she was alive. The most beautiful, selfless, and strongest woman they knew. A mother who gave everything to her 3 boys, and who would, in their words, have been mortified to know those same boys would now grow up without either parent in their lives. That last detail carries a weight of its own, easy to overlook amid the forensic timeline and the courtroom statements. 3 young men lost their mother in a single, calculated act of violence, and lost their father, in every meaningful sense, in that same moment, even though he remains alive, serving a sentence that will keep him from them for at least the next 23 years. Whatever relationship they once had with him, built across decades and countless ordinary visits, ended the instant he chose to walk through that door with a garrotte already prepared. If you want to understand how a case built almost entirely on a confession still requires painstaking work to establish the full truth of intent and planning behind it, that's exactly the kind of story you'll find broken down on this channel every single day. If that's something you're into, hit subscribe. It's free, and it genuinely means a lot. Thank you for watching.